Next up is LaDon Swann from the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium.
Good morning.
Morning.
Someone said something about the panel and their expertise. I'm not a human dimensions person. I'm a fisheries biologist who's worked a lot in aquaculture over my career. But for you to understand the role that Sea Grant had in dealing with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in Mississippi and Alabama in particular, I think you need to understand a little bit about what Sea Grant is. We are a boundary organization, and I didn't really understand what that was until several years ago. There's been a lot of research done on it, and it does a really good job of describing what Sea Grant is and how we can move back and forth between different constituent groups and bring in the science and help translate that science. Sea Grant has been around. We're coming up on our 50th anniversary in 2016. As you can imagine, we're starting to think about how we go about doing that. But we are a boots-on-the-ground organization. If any of you know Margaret Davidson, I used to think it was a backhanded compliment when she called us a boots-on-the-ground organization. But I've learned to embrace that because it really is consistent with what a boundary organization is. Talked a little bit about credibility, and the reason I put this up, I found this, I don't know what month in 2010, but everyone said, well, is that credible information? Is that credible information? I'm like, what is credible information? So actually there's a couple of good books on it. This was a figure out of one of the books. I don't even remember which one it was, but I thought it was good, and the post-it note at the bottom was the guy trying to establish himself as being a credible source of information because he wrote a book. So I guess that doesn't say much for authors. One thing that Sea Grant's involved in right now is the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. That's a $500 million BP-supported independent research program that was stood up during the oil spill, and it's a 10-year program. That program is in its third or fourth year. Kevin Shaw's here, fourth year, and they funded 8 consortia around the U.S., and they're just going to be announcing the next consortia here in a couple weeks. A couple years into that program, Sea Grant was approached by Gomery and asked if we might consider submitting a proposal to them to help with extension, and I mean extension, not outreach, extension for industries that make their living working and living on the coast. That is in our wheelhouse. We do it now, and with the amount of research information coming out of Gomery, we felt like it was a great opportunity to help those industries better understand. To establish a baseline of where people were getting the information in the Gulf, we chose to use a social network analysis. We've used it in the past. We found it very helpful. Now, what you see on the screen now is just one part of the network analysis. We asked a few questions, and one of the questions was, name organizations that you believe provide credible information. And if you can't make it out, it's not so important. But the biggest box there is NOAA, Sea Grant, which is not part of any incident. It's a command program, just a group that works in the communities, is up there with academia and with Gomery. So those are the 4 largest ones. Now, if you tease that out, and I didn't put this diagram up, if you teased out in only those industry groups, tourism, fisheries, those groups that we work primarily with, Sea Grant is the largest of the groups in terms of credible information. What we want to do is in 2 years from now, when we come back and do another analysis, we'll hopefully see changes in how shifts in where people get their information. I've heard a lot of people talk about the time commitment it requires to respond to an oil spill. Certainly in Mobile, where there was an Incident Command Center, I know Tom Hunter has been a member of the National Academy's Gulf Research Advisory Group. Tom is a wonderful man. He's told me some interesting stories about Houston. I know some people were in Mobile, so I appreciate the time that was put in there. There's a lot of people put a lot of time and went to bed at 11 o'clock and got up at 5 or 4 o'clock in the morning to work on oil spill work. And I probably called some of you or sent you emails, some of you here at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning asking you to help me interpret fisheries information. But a couple issues and one cross-cutting. One was seafood safety. I was pinged a lot for seafood safety, and I was pinged a lot by the tourism industry. And I just can't understand why people can't understand when they understand a lot of other things that are more complicated, the sensory analysis of seafood safety. Just to recap that, if you could smell oil, it failed. The areas were closed. If you didn't smell oil, it still was chemically analyzed, and if it passed that area stayed open. If it failed that, it was closed. I'm not sure what's difficult to understand about that, but there are a lot of people in certain groups that did not understand that. I happen to have a friend, Mike DeGree, God bless him. He died in a helicopter crash in Australia. He was a videographer, did a lot of work on Shark Week, was a good friend of, he was a brother of a really good friend of mine, and Mike came down during the oil spill. This is probably in June 10th or something. We took my boat, big mistake, a 25-foot World Cat fishing boat, which I fish a lot, and we went southeast of Dolphin Island and about 20 miles offshore. First thing we did, we smelled oil things, and then we saw slick, and then we saw the sheen. And so here we are, and Bob, I won't tell you who this is, but this happens to be an FDA scientist that's dipping up oil with my eye scoop, putting it into a fruit jar, the classic Alabama way of doing things. And I still have one of those jars, and the second jar I gave it to Mike's brother after he died because Mike was out there. It was an interesting experience. You know, Sea Grant being an honest broker, you know, we couldn't do bumper stickers that said seafood safe to eat. No one believed that anyway, but we did try to find a, you know, common ground and take neutral actions. If you've been around the Gulf, you may have seen things like I enjoy Gulf seafood. Who can argue that? If you eat seafood and you're from the Gulf, whether you believe the seafood is tainted or not, how can you dispute that? So those are the sorts of things that we did for the industry and for the citizens. You know, coastal tourism is another one, and one of the recommendations, those trajectory maps, those color-coded trajectory maps were wonderful tools that you may not recognize it, but the industry made million-dollar decisions based on those maps, tourism industry I'm talking about right now. But I was told by the director of the Gulf Coast Convention and Visitors Bureau in Orange Beach that every day that they missed that, because there was one prediction where the oil was going to hit Orange Beach on this day and it hit 2 weeks later. Those things happen. All I want to emphasize is the importance of those trajectory maps and how, as you continue, whoever creates those continues to refine those, the better off I think those coastal industries will be. You know, when Nancy, and I had the opportunity to meet Nancy in 2010, and she is a wonderful woman, Nancy, and I appreciate you having me here, and this has been a wonderful event. But what Nancy, when we talked, she asked me to talk about mental health and well-being. You know, my son wants to be a psychiatrist. Maybe it's because he saw how dysfunctional my wife and I were during the oil spill, because she also works for a National Estuary Program, and so we're involved in a lot of different things. But certainly the mental health and well-being is very important. And during the oil spill, I went to a workshop in South Carolina, and the best indicator of well-being is job satisfaction. I don't know that we're measuring that, but we probably should. And maybe that's why commercial fishermen work on the water for very little. But so, I don't know if you can see the sound off. A lot of newspapers have that. I can just about tell you the date of that based on those comments. And it was clearly after the well was capped, and people were still talking about claims process and those sorts of things. And so you can just get an idea. And the reason I cut this out, and I rarely cut things out of the newspaper, certainly sound-off columns, was what a bunch of crybabies. And if you pick up one of the peer listing manuals, that is a classic sign of a corrosive community when people who are victimized are still saying, you know, I'm helpless, I'm hopeless, what can I do? And other people who are not in that boat, pun intended, say you're a crybaby. So those, you know, that's what you're seeing in the Mobile Press Register. And J.D. Crowe is an excellent cartoonist. He does things besides Alabama-Auburn football cartoons, but I thought this was a pretty dramatic cartoon that he did, probably sometime early on. But Dr. Gill's right. Probably May 10th, I can tell you when it was, May 10th, we had invited Tori Baker, who's a Sea Grant agent in Cordova, and Joe Banta, who's with Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council. Joe is a gentleman and a scholar. Tori is a wonderful lady. They agreed to come down and speak with groups that we could assemble in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. We did that. I've looked back at the list last night. It's all industry people and elected officials, because there are a lot of questions they had, and I think, you know, Joe and Tori did an excellent job of conveying some of the things that they saw during the Valdez. You know, we later learned that there was not direct correlation in how things unfolded in Alaska compared to the Gulf of Mexico, but it was very helpful. And one of the things that Joe brought, and Joe brought a carload in the airplane, was a binder of papers that he was saying, you need to talk to Steve Piku. They did this peer listening training. Turns out that South Alabama is a member of our Sea Grant Consortium, and Steve had done a seafood consumption survey. We'd funded that a few years earlier about methyl mercury, so I knew Steve quite well. So I said, no kidding. Never realized he was going to Alaska, and that was before I knew the history of Steve in Alaska. So I went and visited Steve. We talked. I managed to cobble together some money. We took the three-ring binder of papers and put it together in a document. We contracted with Steve to help us do training, peer listening training, and I think we trained over 3,000 people around the Gulf of Mexico, worked with the land grant system. Steve did some of the training, but we also worked with groups like Alta Point Mental Health and those sorts of groups to also do the peer listening training. I mean, whether it's an oil spill or hurricane or a recession, you know, we all are peer listeners to some degree, and I think to hone those skills is a very valuable thing to do. You know, it was Admiral Allen talked about Alan Cruz's suicide. That happened on June 24th. That was a Thursday. Ben Ferry's a good friend of mine that's a member of the charter boat industry. I didn't know Mr. Cruz, but I did know Ben, and Ben and I talked, and I approached BP, and BP said, we'll get back to you. The direction they took was to go, and it's a fine direction, is they provided money to the states, went to the state mental health agencies, and they had mental health people walking the docks, so to speak. I think that was great, but those people were not known on those docks, and so there's always ways to refine and improve those sorts of things. So I'm going to wrap up with just a few concluding comments. You know, I do understand the regulatory structure of command and control with as a result of OPA, and I think that's great. You know, I think being an outsider looking into that, and I don't know if I would consider myself an outsider looking in, and I sure know I wouldn't want to be confined to that room as long as people were. So I had the best of both worlds. I could pick like David Kennedy, Buck Sutter was great. You know, I worked with a lot of great people, but you know, Sea Grant had a role, and I played it. I feel like it was a significant role of being able to engage with those communities and drift in and out of different conversations, but always keeping in mind that the science, the peer-reviewed science, trumps everything else. So you know, I think that is an opportunity going forward. I think Gomery appreciates that skill set that Sea Grant has and is taking advantage of that. You know, I would say, and I do, I saved every email and everything from the oil spill, and hundreds of emails from people who said, you know, from the tourism industry, the fishes industry, they would say, interpret this for me. I don't care if it's bad for us, but I want to know what you think about it. And that's not me, that's Sea Grant or a boundary organization. So I think that's very important. I mentioned improve those trajectory models. They were used by a lot of people. And one thing, and I dug this out last night, I forgot I'd written something up for NOAA. When people were questioning the seafood safety, I'd proposed creating an independent seafood safety data review panel, because that was in the heat of the moment. That was, everyone was questioning the data and those sorts of things. And believe it or not, outside of this room, if you go talk to a fisherman or a tourism person, the questions that are being asked or oil spill extension specialist, or can you help me with the claims process? That is still the #1 question by a lot of those in the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm going to end with that. Thank you.